Welcome to our conversation about AI and software, looking at the future of software in a world with AI. I'm Tony Reeves, a partner in our AI and data practice, and I'm a leader on public sector AI adoption. As you just heard, there's a lot of publicity right now about the impact of AI on society and employment, people coming up with new ideas to create business opportunities. It seems almost impossible to avoid news articles threatening the end of society through automation with out-of-control machines, promises to get rich quick using writing children's storybooks, or announcing the latest automation breakthrough. And if you avoided many of those news stories, just wait a few months, because there's some major breakthroughs which are just about to be announced. I'm also old enough to remember the AI bubble from the 90s. That felt like we discovered a new world. We didn't have the capability or the investment to really establish a colony. Yet today, it feels much more like a full colonization. There's an armada of AI ships landing on society and on our industries, whether it's creating stories with Google Bard, Midjourney producing amazing imagery, DeepMind's Gato being able to learn and retain over 600 complex and different separate tasks. AI seems everywhere. So in this short session, we're going to ask a key couple of questions. What does the future of software development look like in a world with AI? What are the biggest opportunities that AI could create there? And if software is alive in a world of AI, is it dead? Or will a zombie hybrid emerge, a sort of software infected with an AI virus, are we seeing software enter its own Last of Us existence? We're going to take a broad view of software as well. We're looking at who develops it, people who test it, support teams keeping it going, and a whole platform and environment that enables software to make such a huge impact on our world. Joining me today on our panel are two leading experts and senior partners in software and AI development. Before we get into the serious stuff, please introduce yourselves and answer a light-hearted viewer question to set our perspectives. If AI or software went to a fancy dress party, what would they wear?
Thank you, Tony. Hell of a question. So I am Scott Campbell. I have the pleasure of being the lead for venture innovation and emerging technologies in our strategy and M&A practice. And I have several opinions about AI, the future. But what I'm really interested in is looking at the history of where did software come from. I help organizations figure out how not to be surprised by things that are not surprising. And I think the rise of AI, as you've discussed, is not a surprising thing. So look at the history where it's come from, and then actually look a little bit at the funding, what's being funded at the moment. That's usually a very good indicator of what's to come in the world of software or AI. And if they go to a party, a fancy dress party, I think we'll take it if this is a metaphor or not for my opinion, but I think maybe a cartoon from my childhood, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, where software would be the turtle and AI would be on the back as Michelle. And I think that would be my couple's outfit for AI and software. Take that as a metaphor for my opinion before it's coming up, but that I think they do well at that part.
That says a lot about what you watched as a child as well.
Thank you. I'm Martin Espoli. I'm a partner in our public sector business, and my bread and butter are big, large-scale technology transformations where we do a lot of software development, and we, my team's building software and the client team's building software. And I previously also have led various guises of our software engineering profession in Deloitte in the UK. So that's kind of my background. If AI went to a fancy dress party, surely it will come dressed as Skynet from the Terminator movies. And I do think, we'll probably get into this, but it's going to be interesting to kind of separate out some very cool demos that are very useless. Nobody really needs to write code by talking to their Apple Watch, even if it's technically possible to make that happen. I think there's some big sort of like hand-wavy, hypey stuff, society is going to end next week. But I also think there's some really exciting opportunities, both in that sort of hybrid and maybe with some bigger change to come. So look forward to talking about that.
Thank you. And I mean, for me, AI would probably be too cool for fancy dress and will probably still end up in the kitchen. While software, I generally would see it as dressed as a classic superhero, something that could be reliable. It's always been there to help us fix the biggest problems. And was probably going to be playing beer pong in the front living room as a result. So let's start with the big serious stuff. I'm inquisitive about how this relationship between AI and software will evolve, and to help us understand that, when you look at AI's capabilities in automating complex tasks, decision-making processes, will that lead to replacement of traditional software in industries and certain sectors? Martin, what do you think?
probably no. Would be the simple answer to your question. I was reminded there's you might know a cartoon called XKCD, which is I read religiously, and there was a cartoon a couple of years ago, which I can't quite remember the phraseology of it, but basically it was about like so it's very someone saying I need an app that tells me whether I'm in a national park. And I'm like, oh, that's easy. Like, a few hours I can look up a GPS coordinate, I can put them on a map, GIS, simple. And also I needed to know whether a picture I took is, what type of bird I took a picture of or something. And it's like, oh, I need a research team and 6 years, and this was kind of, it's hard sometimes to explain to normal people what's easy and what's difficult in the domain of software engineering. And actually what's happened, I think, with AI over time, sort of the floodgates feel to have opened quite recently, is some of those problems that seemed almost rocket science have suddenly become within our grasp, if not easy. Maybe still quite difficult, I think, to build a model that can classify images or generate, rich content or automate complex tasks to do decision-making processes, as you said. But you probably can find an API to call that can do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that will do a couple of things. I think it will open up a class of problems that we previously just sort of didn't think were really solvable in the practical sense for real businesses in the real world. Suddenly we'll want to be able to do those things, and that'd be quite fascinating. I think it's going to change the dynamics of the industry quite a bit, because a lot of that stuff is very capital intensive. So owning the models, owning the compute power to be able to train and run them, we're going to see, we're kind of seeing this with OpenAI, for example, concentration of kind of power and value in certain places. And we're going to have different business relations with those organizations in order to kind of access that knowledge. Do I think that standard software, as we think about it, is here, not in any meaningful time frame? Maybe we'll talk about that.
So I have three personalities, Tony, when answering this, which is partly my strategy not to be made obsolete by AI, make it as difficult as possible with three personalities. I think my provocative position is, yes, it will replace software. That's a bit too simplistic, a bit sensational, the kind of headlines you get. And if you're talking about ChatGPT replacing jobs, that's the sort of answer. More realistic answer is possibly, not sure when, and more likely to work hand in hand. And then my pragmatic answer is that really depends on what you define as software. And I think the broadest terms, maybe, I think if you look at how software breaks down through hardware, operating system, application, user interface, and then the user, there are parts of that AI might replace, parts of how you create that, which we'll come on to talk about. But I'm formed by history, which the problem is not going away. Martin mentioned that AI is able to do things which humans can't do. It also does, software has historically done things which is what humans don't want to do. The automation of process, or the repeatable log, or a programmatic log of that is effectively software. Do this in this way over and over again. So if you take those two bookends, things that humans are really bad at, things that humans don't want to do, I see a sort of symbiotic future, which you could argue is a way of sitting on the fence. But my pragmatic mind looks at where AI investment is going in the global venture capital world and who's part of it. Because I think we forget that this is the third AI revolution, as you said, one in the 1950s funded by government, one in the 1980s, which ended in the late 90s, which gave the rise to the proper Silicon Valley venture capital organization. Each of those followed by AI winters, where everyone went off it. I think that this is probably slightly different because of the composition and the boom in AI. It's a global effort with Asia and the West combined in that effort. The money is coming majority from corporates now, rather than just VCs. And I think then there's all sorts of compute power changes, which mean that big data, and I think AI is in a slightly different environment now. So maybe not an AI winter. I think that the way I'd look at it is where is the money going? And number one on the list is enterprise use cases. So AI is being firmly targeted at the enterprise. So you could argue that there's been a huge software revolution in enterprises. I think it will go hand in hand with that. And it is already, AI is embedded into a lot of software products. I think the next one is, and we'll talk about it in a second, AI development tools for engineering or other things. That's where the second most money is going. The third is actually around medicine and sort of therapeutics. So how you discover that and hopefully fix my cough that I've got developed at the moment. The fourth, and unsurprisingly, but also surprisingly to some, given the hype at the moment, is around generative AI, creative AI tools, which has increased by 20% in funding, but it's still a very small portion. Then you get into the world of Web3 being made more efficient by AI tools, and then security. So that's where the money's going. So in 2 to 3 years, I think we'll see vertically integrated software programs for enterprises or for industries which embed AI. Beyond that, I think it could be a totally different Skynet world. So 3 personalities, yes, not sure when, and depends on what you mean by software.
I think those 3 personalities, we're probably going to start seeing more of that, because as AI generative AI particularly starts to normalize the answer. What do I get by speaking to this AI for the answer? We're probably going to be much more comfortable with diverse views and diverse opinions, because the normal will be, well, I've just got that from AI. So what do you really think? Where do you really stand? So I think those 3 bits are in there. And you also touched about, this software development change. Martin, as AI continues to evolve and integrate, how will the software developers change? Will they transition more towards designing AI systems, or still maintaining traditional software as a role?
I think there's a couple of different answers to that. First of all, I think what's fascinating about neural networks and deep learning and all these kind of different tools that come up, this is like hardcore computer science. And actually, since maybe the 50s or 60s or whatever, where a lot of innovation was happening, how do we even make computers do anything? A lot of software engineering and computer science are they're not necessarily the same thing. Like the mathematics and kind of complexity behind computer science has been quite academic in most real world sort of business use cases. Most of the people that work for us doing extremely high quality software engineering, they don't necessarily have a computer science background, they have a software engineering background. But I think what's happening with the ability to create new models, optimize, train, that has suddenly moved into a level of, you need a level of sophistication of understanding that is taught at MIT or is taught at Stanford or whatever. And therefore, there's a small number of people that I think are commanding extremely high salaries, or because they can't just read a book and get good at some of that stuff. It's not been commoditized yet in the way that being a Java developer, for example, arguably has been. So I think that's an interesting thing about the people we think of as programmers. There'll be a smaller number of them, I think, but that will sort of be extremely valuable to the organizations that can retain them, and that would be fascinating. The second question then is what you might call AI accelerated coding. So this is things like GitHub Copilot or other tools like that either can reason about your code and make it better somehow, or generate code for you, build me an API for this thing, or give me a set of test cases for this code or whatever. That's already being used. I think there's an interesting kind of challenges around what's it been trained on and how accurate can the answer be. I think generative AI is trained on the information you give it, and there's an awful lot of buggy code, and when it's trained on buggy code, you're also going to get bugs, right? So
yes.
So actually the job sometimes be a bit more, well, I've got a draft of something from some assistance, some AI driven assistance, but I do still need to understand it. And I think that's quite fundamental, because that means that you need a relatively good understanding of what the thing is doing. And I think there's a risk, I think, that we'll have a lot of people producing code that they don't really understand what it does. And when it goes wrong, they won't know how to fix it. And that will produce kind of a lower quality of output at the end of the day. But I think in the hands of a properly trained programmer, if you like, it can be a massive productivity boost. Now, I think I read a quote, and I can't remember who to attribute it to, but it's sort of like, if AI assistants can make one programmer 100 times more efficient, are we going to fire 99 programmers out of 100, or are we going to produce 100 times as much software? And I suspect that the world's appetite for digital software solutions is very far from satisfied. So I think we will just see much more in the hands of people like that. I think the final point about how it's going to change is, probably coming back to the point I made at the beginning, there are a number of tools, libraries, APIs, frameworks that are actually, in some ways, they're exactly like all other tools and libraries and APIs and frameworks. There's, you read the documentation and you use them. But I think familiarity with those tools, like things like TensorFlow for building and generating models, or APIs from Amazon and Microsoft and so on to access the models that they own and run, that knowledge, I don't think is particularly hard, but I think that will be extremely important because they'll just become fundamental building blocks of things that we're now creating.
I want to come back in a minute about this one developer, 99
Yeah.
developers, because for me, AI enhancing human ingenuity is the whole thing. If we're not putting those humans, people at the heart of what we're doing and enhancing what they do, then we're replacing, and that's probably not something. But what's your where's the money going on software development?
On software development, well, I think the phrase that the market is using is the 10x developer or the 10 times developer, and I think over
I was
that.
going for 100.
You go for it. Easy, Martin. Easy. We'll start with 10.
Sorry.
I think that that 10x developer is going to drive a very interesting trend in the market. And I think when you saw the utility of compute increase with cloud platforms and you saw development tools getting much more sophisticated, what we saw was a consolidation at the operating software layer and a massive fragmentation at the application layer. So an app for everything. I think there's been a slight consolidation there, particularly in the enterprise. I think if you imagine the 10x developer and what that will bring, again, a future that is not surprising, is you'll be able to do much more effectively for a much more targeted user set. And you could see arguably more software because actually you can develop much more. It's much quicker and faster. You can experiment faster. Businesses can do things but in a more compliant way, which is much faster. So you could argue in the next 3 to 5 years, increasing fragmentation of that application layer. The user interface is a big challenge. I think that will need to change. And I think that's where a lot of money is going, which is if we're going to be effective at using AI, is sitting in front of a keyboard the best interface with AI? And is it an earbud? Is it a glass? Is it a watch? Or is it something you speak to? I think a lot of money will be going into that interface. So how do I interact with something which talks and sounds like a human? So I only see software being required to drive all of that in the short future. As we move into a consolidation again, and I'll get onto some timings around that and how you can predict that. As you get onto that consolidation back down, who knows? But I think we're quite a way off that. And all technology booms have always increased job creation in most geographies. So I'm a firm believer that the 10x developer will mean more specific software rather than less.
So let's pick up what that means with this, enhancing human ingenuity and the idea that, quite often people have brilliant ideas, but they lack the technical capability or experience or knowledge to do something with that idea. So, at the moment, we're seeing lots of people creating novels or writing stuff. And, that might be a good book. It might be a really bad read, but people are suddenly saying, I can now do this because AI is helping me do it. So in software development, Martin, are we going to see a huge increase in people learning and using code with AI acting as a bit of a guide, a mentor, and a crutch? And will we see a great democratization of software? And then afterwards, I want to talk about, and will that software be any good?
Right. Yeah. So there are probably two kind of types of answers to that, I guess. And it comes down to what is the way that we have traditionally built software. So today, you can ask Copilot or GPT to write you some syntactically valid Python or Java or C or whatever language you use. And we're going to remember that those languages were created to be written by humans. So you kind of have this sort of translation of like my intent into some code that is the code that a human would have written. And usually it is sort of based on code it's have written and sort of synthesized in some way. And as I said earlier, I think be able to make use of that, you still need something of an understanding of what that code does and where to put it in your broader architecture and so on. At the other extreme, I think you have this thing where I can have an intent and a system can magically appear for me. I want an e-commerce website that can sell, my custom design shoes. And spontaneously that comes into existence because the AI is provisioning infrastructure and doing, I suspect that to get to that level of democratization, that intermediary of today's architecture, today's languages, today's ways of building and constructing software solutions is going to be a major constraint. It's going to be much more sensible to come up with like a platform that has the building blocks that are kind of optimized for an AI to assemble them. I don't know, you might know, Scott, whether anyone is actually building that, because that is probably it's a very kind of disruptive
Yes.
tool that would have to be created. But I think we just got to remember that, like, certainly things like GPT, what they're very good at is producing things that are analogous to what people have written and put on the internet. That's what it's doing. It's read the entire internet and it's kind of figured out how to sound like any part of the internet or some mashup thereof, including code, or song lyrics, or whatever it might be. Is that the representation that people are going to need to democratize software? I suspect it's going to be an inherent constraint until you get something that is actually much more divorced from that traditional way of building.
It's interesting, isn't it, Martin? We've moved into a phase of humanity which is skeptical of technology, and I think that we moved away from sort of worshipping technology to probably 10 years ago to now being heavily skeptical. The hearings you hear about social media companies, exactly what privacy concerns are, GDPR rules, and I think that the stumbling block in adoption for sort of mass democratization of AI is going to be around that. The big challenge that generative AI or other AI, which again is a very broad topic, has is transparency and compliance with regulation. And I think that I'm not worried because we've got checks and balances in our system that prevent AI from becoming rampant or replacing jobs or doing things which are non-transparent. And I think we chatted just before coming on this panel, and AI is getting really good, but the problem with AI is it is unpredictably bad. And I think that you mentioned that it will train on a bias of a code base. We might get to sort of an AI which is, the singularity where it's not there, but we're miles away from that now. I think that in software development, producing code which doesn't work and not being able to understand why is a big problem at the moment. And I think until we solve that problem of transparency in some AIs, it's going to continue to be the purview of compliance and risk functions, particularly within corporates, to say, no, you can't use that technique because we have no way of standing behind it. So I think there are things that are going to democratize AI and its usage. And there's a great economist called, two of them, Carlota and Perez, who you will be familiar with the sigmoidal or S curves of technology or innovation adoption. And at the moment, we're sort of in that sort of frenzy phase, which is in the install phase, particularly around Gen AI. What usually governs whether you go into that massive growth phase is, ironically, and this is the Carlota Perez work, is a financial crisis. So what drives mass adoption is that breakup of a market or of an economic marketplace, and then recombining it together using AI or using new tools. I think what might drive democratization of AI is, depending on what you believe, how on the cusp of or in the middle of that crisis we are, where businesses, governments and economies are forced to do new things.
And this is where I'll bring in that being better than human. And I think most people's understanding of how good is that, we always look at the best person in a field and go, that's the best human, that's how I want AI to be. Yeah. And actually, in reality, it's slightly better than average. It's kind of good enough to be able to get in there. So how do we balance that out? Because when you have markets which are looking for return on investment, efficiencies, productivities, and given the option of, I can probably get by with an AI solution, how do we start addressing that? So, software developers, that goes, I could be doing 100 times, or I could be taking the 99% saving. How do we address that?
I wonder whether, maybe software is not the best example I have for this, but one of my other passions is music, and I was reading a comment really on it was a dissection of a piece of modern music, and it basically said there's no dynamism in the singing or in any of there's no groove, so all the beats are perfectly on the line because the beats are programmed, and the voice is perfectly in tune because it's auto-tuned to within an inch of his life. And and somebody said maybe record companies are doing this in order to kind of train the populace to be receptive to completely AI generated music, and that might be true. And because if you're right now, if you're trying to produce a hit record, it's a very high risk thing. It's very expensive because you've got to hire, musicians and recording engineers, whatever, and it's becoming cheaper and cheaper over time. There was a thing that went viral, with some sort of like artificially combined two artists that I'm too old to know the proper names of. I think it was Drake and The Weeknd, but don't ask me who. But and it was on Spotify, and it got pulled because it wasn't real, essentially. What happens when you flood Spotify with, if the cost drops to zero of producing a potential hit record, because you don't need to pay anyone to do it, you just need to produce 1,000 versions of it, and you don't care which one it is, but the one you start earning royalties on. I wonder whether, and the same could be said for novels, as your example earlier, or really any kind of content production, right? Whether we end up with a sort of, the average quality will be significantly lower, but because the cost is basically zero, the marginal cost is basically zero, we'll find fields that just get saturated with crap in the hope that like one thing, and maybe apps will be like that, like you'll see 1,000 apps in the App Store that all do a bad job of something, but one of them ends up making somebody money because people just happen to install it. And that worries me a bit, because I think it's very hard to undo that. If the internet is full of junk, it becomes very hard to build a good search engine or whatever. It already is full of junk, but you take my point. So I do think that is a risk, actually, that people will be incentivized to do things that will kind of destroy the commons to an extent.
Yeah, and one example I'm using at the moment is, I was lucky enough to be in New York a couple of weeks back, and Museum of Modern Art, top floor, Van Gogh paintings. There was 5 people looking at them. On the bottom floor was a massive screen with an AI generated image, which constantly kept changing and moving. 150 people were sat there watching it going. So I think this idea that, is that art? Is that junk? That's a completely different panel session coming up, I think. We only got 4 minutes left. So, so come back to where we started, software in a world of with AI, is it dead, alive, or this Last of Us zombie hybrid? In a few words, Scott, what's your take?
God, in a few words. So I don't believe AI is better than humans. I think it's different. And so I think that at the moment, that's always been true. So I think we're on a natural evolution, which will move seamlessly from software to AI plus software. And let's be frank, most of the software we use today has AI embedded in it, right? And it's not a new thing. I do think that a democratization of AI will discover new markets, new tools, new ways of doing it. For example, your music example, YouTube content creators can't use royalty music because it gets very expensive. So there are now engines that generate music that they can use royalty free at a zero cost, which is the definition of disruption, by the way. Like worse, lower incremental cost moves up into high quality markets. So following that trend, I think we'll see, Tony, that AI will be popping up in unexpected places in our lives on the back of software, much like my lowbrow example of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle at the start.
It's a great start. Martin, your sum up, please.
I'm an optimist, so I think alive and better. I don't think the benefits will accrue equally to everybody. So the winners and losers of tomorrow will be different companies or individuals or groups, which will cause disruption.
Thank you. And for me, I think that we are probably going to start seeing this hybrid environment. And having referenced The Last of Us, I'm sure some people are suddenly thinking, was that TV show really about AI and not about fungus?